The U.S. federal government employs roughly 2.4 million people across over 400 agencies. That's not including postal workers and active-duty military personnel. President Trump has said he wants to decrease the size of that workforce by up to 10%, or 240,000 people. The effort to downsize the government has been led by Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. Tens of thousands of federal employees were laid off in recent weeks.
We were leaving work fully employed and coming back the next morning without a job.
But now, the terminations are being challenged in court, and the administration has been ordered to issue sweeping job reinstatements.
Two federal courts on opposite coasts taking similar cases and coming to similar decisions here, ruling that the firings of so-called probationary workers were improper mass firings and ordering that tens of thousands of these workers be put back on their jobs.
It's unclear when reinstated employees will be asked to return to work, as some are reportedly being put on administrative leave. The Trump administration has also moved to dismantle entire agencies, such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Department of Education. But again, courts around the country are challenging the legality of those cuts.
This has been an extraordinary first part of the second Trump term. What's been most extraordinary is the way in which the new administration has fundamentally destroyed so much of the capability in our government.
At the center of it all, a narrative that the federal government is too large.
We're cutting down government. We're cutting down the size of government. We have to. We're bloated. We're sloppy. We have a lot of people that aren't doing their job.
Efforts to streamline the government workforce and cut down on spending are not new.
I am ordering a reduction of the federal bureaucracy by at least 100,000 positions over the next 4 years. The steps we're taking today will save the American taxpayers $9 billion.
There's no doubt that there's bloat in some places, in some functions. But you gotta identify it first. You don't just cut the whole thing. What they're gonna have to do is they're cutting the whole thing, and they're gonna have to go back and build again, right, the things that they cut out that in fact turn out to be essential.
So just how wasteful has the U.S. federal government become? And has it gotten worse over time? And will cutting government workers and programs actually make a dent in the nation's more than $1.8 trillion deficit? The first few months of the second Trump administration have been a roller coaster for federal employees impacted by mass layoffs.
I was one of the thousands of federal workers terminated this weekend.
I have gone through the entire range of emotions this past weekend. There is a lot of sadness in my heart. There is also a lot of anger.
Roughly 24,000 workers received notices that their jobs were being terminated. Now, at least one court has ordered that the Trump administration rehire those employees. Beneath the chaos, a renewed debate around the size of government has emerged, which Trump claims is too large. But what do the numbers say? Here's a look at the federal workforce. The U.S. government is the country's largest employer, with more workers on its payroll than Amazon or Walmart. Around 2.4 million people are on the federal payroll. That number doesn't include more than 600,000 U.S. postal workers, government contractors, or active-duty military personnel. More than 80% of those employees live outside the D.C. area, in places like California, Texas, and Florida. The Department of Veterans Affairs was the largest employer in 2024, followed by the Department of Homeland Security, the Army, and the Navy.
A lot of people just think of like white-collar bureaucrats making all these decisions that they don't care about or that don't affect them. That's far from the truth. These are nurses, these are park rangers.
The single largest occupation of federal workers is healthcare related, and the most common occupation is nursing. The second most common occupation was administrative.
When we talk about the civil service, we're talking about the 2 million or so career professionals who do everything from inspect the meat that you buy in the supermarkets so it's not going to get your kids sick, or those air traffic controllers who are responsible for making sure our air system is safe, or the intelligence analyst who is trying to stop incursions by China or Russia into our digital infrastructure. I mean, the list is long and it affects everybody in all kinds of different ways.
President Trump has cited multiple reasons for the cuts. The first, federal budget savings.
Tremendous saving for you. We want to downsize government, but make it better.
The president has argued that layoffs will help balance the federal budget and place more responsibility on state governments.
For a lot of Americans, they did feel like our government was too big, it's too bloated. They want to see cuts.
I do think that there is tremendous upside to reducing the size of the federal government given the massive expansion that has happened. And just starting from a 10,000-foot level, what goes to the federal government does not go to individuals and businesses.
There's no question the U.S. is facing a budget crisis. In 2024, the U.S. spent $1.83 trillion more than it took in, a deficit that has been steadily growing for years. But how do federal workers fit into the budget? The average federal worker earns a little over $100,000 per year. In the fiscal 2024 year, the government spent $835 billion in personnel compensation and benefits. That number makes up only 8.6% of the government's total spending. And that's less than the amount of interest paid on the government's debt, which was $1.1 trillion last year.
The reality is that this is going to cost the American taxpayer more money than it will ever save. It is not that large of a proportion of our federal government's expense. It's quite small against the larger program requirements that we have in our government.
But data shows that the federal workforce has actually remained about the same size for the past 50 years, even as federal spending has quintupled. Studies show that the gap can be explained by an increase in the number of federal contractors. One report estimates that federal contractors currently outnumber federal employees by more than 2 to 1, although the exact number of federal contractors is not known.
The actual headcount of our federal government is about the same size as it was in 1969. What's different is that we have a whole bunch more contractors and grantees. If you were really trying to control for costs, you would be focusing way much more there than you would be on the direct headcount of federal employees, and you'd actually be trying to reduce federal employees strategically, which is not what is happening now.
The Trump administration has started to examine government contracts, although some of those efforts have stalled. Some experts say the firings are a roundabout way of cutting back on both contracts and entitlement programs.
There's room for savings coming from a smaller size of the federal workforce, but that's not the bulk of the savings. It's more the spending that's going out the door from all of these programs. There are federal workers that are administering these programs and that are issuing those payments, but you have to actually reduce the size of those programs of payments to get those big savings.
Elaine Camark worked in the Clinton administration and managed the National Performance Review. The program reduced the federal workforce by 426,000 employees and created the smallest federal government since Eisenhower's presidency.
I think it's a good thing that they're looking at all the contracts the government lets, and certainly there are some contracts that probably shouldn't have been let that are sort of silly. On the other hand, they're all mixed in, right? You gotta do this with a scalpel, not an axe. Every year, the U.S. government, through USAID, buys $2.1 billion worth of wheat, soybeans, and rice from American farmers and sends this to starving people overseas in famine countries. That, I think, is a lot of Americans would think is a pretty good use of taxpayer dollar.
Under Clinton's reform programs, the administration worked with Congress to make strategic cutbacks and eliminate regulations. In testimony, Camark said that the program ultimately saved the government around $136 billion.
I'm a big believer in reviews of federal government functioning. There are regulations that have to be thrown out. There's functions that become, sort of yesterday's work. So I think it's a good thing to do, but they're doing that in a way that they're taking down entire organizations which have statutory authority. I think the difference here, the critical difference is we weren't looking just to cut. We titled our report, Works Better, Costs Less. And the works better was as important as the cost less.
A second rationale for the cuts is smaller government is better. Some argue that the cutbacks are aimed at moving the workforce into the private sector or state and local governments.
A smaller government footprint, smaller government sector just brings labor and capital resources to the private sector, and that is a disinflationary story.
A lot of the things that the federal government is doing now would be far better served by state and local governments or even private charities and businesses themselves, because when you have this approach of like the top down is often you don't get the results that you want because policymakers in DC don't know how these programs are working and how best to serve people on the ground.
But does a smaller federal workforce actually move resources to the private sector? Nearly half of voters surveyed in 2024 believe that the government is doing things that are better left to the private sector. However, experts predict there may be downsides to this migration.
You'd absolutely see that. There's people who are highly skilled, a lot of PhDs, a lot of lawyers, et cetera, with huge expertise. They're going to go into the private sector. That's going to be competition in local economies all over the country. And so it's also going to hurt local economies.
I think that there is a desire to shrink the size of the government. That's natural when people feel like they're not receiving the services that they're paying for with their taxes. But to just kind of eliminate programs at random and eliminate employees at random does not achieve that goal.
While the legality of the firings plays out in courts across the country, there's concern that if Trump's efforts to downsize the federal workforce are successful, public services may be impacted.
In terms of the EPA, I think people are going to see notices that they'll have to boil their water. I think it's going to be detrimental to our environment.
Layoffs at the U.S. Forest Service, for example, have raised questions about what resources will be available to prevent wildfires in the wake of deadly fires in Los Angeles this year. Veterans are bracing for the potential impact mass terminations may have on the services provided to them by the VA. And new layoffs at the Department of Education could impact school and university access to federal funds. Thousands of newly unemployed, highly skilled workers could also have implications for the economy.
When you cut all that spending, the private sector that's the beneficiary of that, plus cutting 10% of the workforce in the federal government, which is out of 2.4 million jobs, 240,000 jobs, together it's 1 million jobs. And that takes you from 4.1% unemployment, we believe, to 4.5% unemployment. And so the pain of getting through that
how do you get
difficult.
through that, right? That is going to be painful. And it's going to be a potential hit on growth. How can it not be?
It will be a hit on growth.
I think there's a general lack of understanding of what federal workers do for the American public. I really worry about a future in which the federal civil service has been demonized and we don't have skilled workers in the federal civil service, and things start to happen like our parents and grandparents stop getting their Social Security checks, or veterans stop getting health care that they need, that food banks and food pantries don't have food in them.
Experts say the mass firings could end up costing more taxpayer dollars than saving money, as more cases will be brought forward alleging the firings were illegal.
You have an administration that has taken the position, sue me, I'll see you in court, rather than being very careful about using the public's authority in ways that are not going to either disrupt important accepted norms or create havoc in our society and legal system.
They've set up basically a constitutional crisis because everything they're trying to do, whether it's shut down USAID or the consumer agency, is a law that Congress passed. So they're headed straight for the Supreme Court and straight for a big fight.